A prayer about grace. When I am grateful for God's kindness. Prayer. Lord Jesus, watching my child run and hide when he disobeys reminds me how grateful I am for the gift of your grace. You see me and know everything I do, and yet you extend forgiveness without heaping shame on my head. Your example is why I can scoop up my child in my arms and love him despite his failures. Thank you for always loving me, always believing in me, and always walking with me through the mountains and valleys of my life. Thank you for loving me despite my flaws, and help me to extend that same grace to my child. May he learn to live in the freedom that comes from turning his sins and weaknesses over to you. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 8-9. Reflection. Speaks deeply to the paradox of strength found in weakness. Paul shares his personal experience of pleading with God to remove a suffering or challenge, often referred to as a thorn in the flesh, only to receive a divine response that seems counterintuitive. Rather than removing the difficulty, God offers the assurance that his grace is sufficient and that his power is most evident when we are weak. The sufficiency of grace, God's answer to Paul's repeated requests, was not a solution to the problem, but the promise that his grace was enough to sustain him. This highlights the idea that God's provision doesn't always look like the removal of hardship. Instead, God's grace empowers us to endure and thrive even in the midst of struggles. Strength in weakness. There's an unexpected strength that comes from weakness. When we are weak, we have less reliance on ourselves and more reliance on God. This openness to God's power allows his strength to shine through. Paul's willingness to boast about his weaknesses reflects a shift in understanding that suffering is not a sign of God's absence, but an opportunity for his presence and power to be made clear. Humility and dependence. The idea that God's power works best in weakness calls for humility. In our culture, we often view weakness as something to avoid or overcome at all costs. But here, Paul teaches that our struggles and vulnerabilities are not to be hidden or dismissed. Instead, they allow us to become more dependent on God and less self-reliant, which can lead to greater spiritual growth and intimacy with him. Transformative perspective. Paul's boast in weakness challenges our typical perspective on suffering. Rather than seeing challenges as obstacles or signs of failure, they can become means of experiencing God's power in profound ways. This transformation in how we view difficulties can change how we approach life, leading us to see that God is working even in what seems like defeat. Living with purpose in suffering. For those struggling with hardships, this passage encourages them to find purpose in their pain. Just as Paul learned to embrace weakness, we too can discover that in our moments of deepest vulnerability, God's power is most clearly revealed. It's a reminder that suffering is not meaningless, but can serve as a vehicle for deeper fellowship with God and for the manifestation of his power. In essence, this passage invites us to find peace and strength in our weaknesses, knowing that God's grace is sufficient to sustain us. And his power is most evident when we stop relying on our own strength and instead depend on him.